The bell above the door of the Gilded Lily didn't so much chime as it sighed, a soft, melodic exhalation of brass on brass that had announced customers for nearly 70 years. To Alara Ellie Vance, it was the sound of home. She stood behind the worn oak counter, the scent of damp earth, hyacinth, and something indefinably green filling her lungs. It was a perfume that clung to her clothes and hair, a constant reminder of where she belonged, even when she was miles away, trapped in the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of a downtown law firm. At 28, Ellie was a paralegal, a fact she delivered with a carefully practiced neutrality that she hoped masked the faint taste of disappointment. Her mother, Eleanor, had been a brilliant litigator, a legal supernova who had burned brightly and briefly before a car accident had extinguished her light 15 years ago. Ellie had inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's steady hands, a combination that made her exceptionally good at organizing case files and utterly terrified of standing before a judge. Being a paralegal felt safe. It was law-adjacent, a seat in the orchestra rather than the pressure of the conductor's podium. Sunlight thick and golden streamed through the shop's tall, mullioned windows, illuminating a billion dancing dust motes. It was a controlled chaos of life. Buckets of tightly furled roses and exuberant peonies crowded the floor. Ferns cascaded from hanging baskets, their fronds tickling the heads of taller customers. On the counter, a half-finished bouquet of delphiniums, lavender, and Queen Anne's lace lay waiting, a tapestry of blues and whites Ellie had been weaving together. "A little more of the lace, I think, dear," a voice soft as moss said from the back. Maeve Vance, Ellie's grandmother, emerged from the humid sanctuary of the greenhouse. At 75, she moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a plant turning toward the sun. Her silver hair was pinned in a loose bun, and her hands, though wrinkled, were strong and stained with earth. She was the heart and soul of the Gilded Lily, the keeper of its history and its quiet magic. "It needs to breathe," Maeve continued, her fingers gently adjusting a step. "Like a good story. You can't rush the telling," Ellie smiled. Everything to Maeve had a story. The weeping fig in the corner was a cutting from a tree that had shaded a poet's bench. The stubborn orchid that refused to bloom was sulking over a forgotten promise. The shop itself was the longest story of all, a narrative written in 50 years of rent receipts, in the scuffs on the floorboards from 1,000 nervous grooms, and in the faint water rings on the shelves left by generations of vases. "It's for the Millers," Ellie said. "Their anniversary." "Ah, David and Sarah," Maeve's eyes twinkled. "I sold him the corsage for their first high school dance. White carnations." He was so nervous he nearly crushed it. This was the rhythm of their life, a peaceful melody of memory and petals. It was a world away from the aggressive staccato of Ellie's other life, the world of mergers and acquisitions, of contracts designed to crush, not to nurture. The Gilded Lily was the last holdout on a block that was rapidly being devoured by progress. On one side, a sleek glass-walled coffee chain pulsed with sterile efficiency. On the other, a luxury condo building scraped the sky, its polished chrome glinting with an impersonal arrogance. The flower shop was an anachronism, a pocket of defiant, unruly life in a city that increasingly valued the neat, predictable lines of a balance sheet. Ben Carter, a local journalist who had a soft spot for lost causes, had called the shop an urban oasis in his latest column for the City Chronicle. He'd been coming in for weeks, ostensibly to buy a single stem for his desk, but really to soak in the atmosphere and chat with Maeve. He saw the shop the way Ellie did, not as a retail space but as a sanctuary. Finishing the bouquet, Ellie wrapped the stems in brown paper and tied them with twine. The simple, rustic presentation was their signature. They didn't deal in ostentatious cellophane or garish ribbons. The flowers were meant to speak for themselves. As she worked, she felt a familiar pang of anxiety. Her own voice, she feared, was just a whisper. She was good at research, at finding the single, overlooked precedent in a mountain of case law, but she lacked the bold confidence that had made her mother a legend. In her own life, she was a supporting character. The bell sighed again. This time, it wasn't a customer. It was a man in a suit too sharp and too gray for the colorful world of the shop. He held a courier's envelope, his face a mask of professional indifference. "For the proprietor," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at the flowers. He didn't seem to notice the scent of the air. He was a creature from the other world, the world of concrete and contracts. Ellie took the envelope. It was thick and heavy, bearing the embossed logo of a name she knew all too well from her work, Finch Development Group. Her stomach tightened. Alastair Finch was less a developer and more a conqueror, a man who didn't build on empty land but on the rubble of what came before. "Oh, thank you," she managed to say. The man nodded and left, the bell's sigh sounding more like a gasp this time. "What is it, dear?" Maeve asked, wiping her hands on her aprons. Ellie's fingers, suddenly numb, fumbled with the seal. As she slid out the documents, the language was cold, dense, and brutally clear. Legalese, her native tongue, but a dialect she had never wanted to read in this context. Phrases like notice to vacate, termination of tenancy, and pursuant to municipal redevelopment plan leaped off the page. She looked up from the paper, her eyes meeting her grandmother's. The vibrant colors of the shop seemed to fade, washed out by the stark white of the document in her hand. The scent of hyacinth was suddenly cloying, funereal. "It's an eviction notice," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're demolishing the block. We have 90 days, the world didn't stop." The dust motes continued their lazy dance in the sunbeams. Outside, the city's traffic hummed its ceaseless, indifferent song. But inside the Gilded Lily, the air had crystallized. The eviction notice lay on the counter between them, an alien artifact of cold, hard lines in a world of soft, living curves. It felt like a death warrant. Ellie's paralegal mind took over, a defense mechanism against the wave of panic rising in her chest. She scanned the document again, her eyes snagging on the details. Alastair Finch's name was there, not as a signature, but as the monolithic power behind the corporate letterhead. The project was codenamed The Pinnacle, a luxury mixed-use high-rise that promised to be the new jewel of the downtown core. The flower shop wasn't a home or a legacy, it was Lot 7B, an obstacle. 90 days. The phrase echoed in her mind. 90 days to dismantle a life's work. 90 days to erase a 70-year story. Maeve, however, was unnervingly calm. She picked up the notice, her earthy fingers tracing the crisp, laser-printed letters. She didn't read it with the frantic terror Ellie felt. She read it with a kind of weary curiosity, as if it were a particularly uninspired piece of junk mail. "Well," Maeve said, her voice even. "He's certainly got expensive paper." She placed the notice back on the counter and walked over to a drooping peace lily, her attention seemingly already elsewhere. "This one's thirsty. Grandma, did you hear me?" Ellie's voice trembled. "Oh, Finch. Alastair Finch is kicking us out. He's going to tear it all down." "I heard," Maeve said, her back to Ellie as she filled a small watering can. "Alastair. I remember his father, Thomas. A man who always took the last biscuit on the plate." She sprinkled water into the lily's soil. "Some things, I suppose, are hereditary." Ellie stared at her, bewildered. She wanted screaming, crying, a shared explosion of rage and grief. What she got was gardening wisdom and folksy commentary on hereditary greed. "What are we going to do?" Maeve turned, her expression unreadable. "We are going to do what we have always done. We are going to tend to the living. And you, my dear, are going to look in the back rooms. In the old records." "The records, for what? An accounting of our 50 years of paying rent on time? I don't think Finch cares about our perfect tenant record." "Perhaps not," Maeve said, a flicker of something sharp in her eyes. "But contracts are stories, Alara. And the beginning is just as important as the end. More so sometimes. Go look." The big green ledger, the one from when your grandfather was still with us. Feeling adrift, Ellie did as she was told. The back room was a fragrant, cluttered archive of the shop's history. It smelled of dried lavender and decaying paper. Shelves overflowed with ledgers, shoeboxes full of receipts and photo albums. It was Maeve's domain, a place Ellie rarely ventured. She found the ledger, a heavy cloth-bound volume with 1975 tooled in faded gold on the spine. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded, yellowed document. It was a lease agreement. She carried it back to the counter, the crisp, modern eviction notice looking obscene next to the soft, aged paper in her hand. The lease was typed on an old manual typewriter, the letters soft and slightly uneven. The landlord was a family-owned realty company that had been bought out by a larger firm in the 80s, which in turn had been absorbed by an even larger one in the 90s, a corporate food chain that had inevitably led to the belly of the beast, Finch Development Group. The monthly rent, a figure that made Ellie's breath catch, was laughably small by today's standards. Her eyes scanned the boilerplate legal text, the familiar clauses and subclauses. And then she saw it. At the bottom of the last page, below the typed signatures of her grandfather and the original landlord, was a handwritten addendum. The ink was faded to a soft blue-gray, but the cursive was clear and elegant. It felt like a secret whispered across half a century. Addendum C. Upon the faithful completion of 50 years of continuous tenancy and rent, stewardship and ownership of the property at 142 Blossom Street shall transfer to the lessee. This clause, a recognition of enduring community cultivation, shall be binding on all successors and assigns. Ellie read it once, then a second time. A wild, impossible hope, as fragile and beautiful as a new shoot breaking through frozen ground, began to unfurl in her chest. 50 years. They had passed their 50th anniversary last spring. As she looked at the date on the lace. Then she looked at the calendar on the wall. The timeline matched. Grandma, she said, her voice hoarse. What is this? Maeve walked over, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. That, she said, her finger tapping the handwritten lines, is the clause that Thomas Finch's father, a better man than his son, agreed to with your grandfather. They shook on it. A gentleman's agreement written into the lease because your grandfather believed a handshake should always be backed by ink. A 50-year ownership clause, is that even legal? Can something like that be enforceable after all this time, after all these buyouts? That's your world, Alara, not mine, Maeve said softly. You know the language of these things. My language is in the soil. But I know a promise when I see one. And your grandfather never made a promise he couldn't keep. Ellie stared at the clause, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it had company. The hope was growing, a fierce, defiant thing. This wasn't just a flower shop. It was a promise. And Alistair Finch, in his arrogance, had just tried to bulldoze it. He had sent them a notice to end their story, not knowing that he had just handed them the one thing they needed to write the final chapter themselves. The next few days passed in a blur of caffeine and rising panic. The impossible hope sparked by the handwritten clause was a flickering candle in the hurricane of legal reality. Ellie brought the lease and the eviction notice to her office at Sterling and Croft, a place that suddenly felt like enemy territory. Her boss, Arthur Sterling, was a senior partner with a mane of white hair and a reputation for being a legal grizzly bear, fearsome, but fiercely protective of his own. He read both documents in his cavernous, book-lined office, his face impassive. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It's beautiful, Arthur said finally, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at the eviction notice. He was looking at the old lace, a faint smile on his lips. They don't write them like this anymore. Enduring community cultivation, that's poetry. It's poetry, Arthur, but is it a shield? Ellie asked, her hands clenched in her lap. Arthur leaned back, steepling his fingers. Maybe. Maybe not. This addendum is highly unusual. A vestige of an era when business was done with a handshake. Finch's lawyers will argue it's an anachronistic, unenforceable relic. They'll say it's vague. They'll claim it was voided by one of the dozen corporate takeovers that happened between 1975 and today. They'll argue it's superseded by municipal zoning laws. They will, in short, throw $1 million legal team at this piece of paper until it's shredded into dust. Every word was a hammer blow to Ellie's fragile confidence. And what would you argue, she pressed. I'd argue that binding on all successors and assigns is as clear as a summer's day, Arthur grunted. I'd argue that 50 years of uninterrupted rent payments constitutes a level of good faith that the court must recognize. I'd argue that the spirit of the law should, in this case, triumph over the brute force of its letter. He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of experience. It's a David and Goliath case, Ellie. And Goliath has a much, much bigger retainer. He looked at her, his gaze softening. Finch's lead counsel on these projects is usually Julian Croft. Ellie's stomach plummeted. Julian Croft, the other name on the firm's letterhead. A brilliant, ruthlessly efficient lawyer who had been her mother's protégé before becoming her rival. He was everything Ellie wasn't, bold, confident, and utterly unflappable in a courtroom. The thought of facing him made her feel physically ill. He knew my mother, Ellie said quietly. He did, Arthur said. And he will not hesitate to use that and everything else in his arsenal to win. So you have a choice. You can take the buyout Finch will inevitably offer, it'll be insultingly low, but it's something, or you can fight. And if you fight, you can't do it from here. It would be a catastrophic conflict of interest. He was firing her, but in the kindest way possible. He was setting her free. That night, sleep was impossible. Ellie sat in her small apartment, surrounded by stacks of legal pads and property law textbooks. The city glittered outside her window, a galaxy of lights, one of which would soon be Alistair Finch's pinnacle. She pulled up everything she could find on him. He was a master of public relations, his company's website filled with slick videos of smiling families in gleaming new condos. He sponsored charities, sat on museum boards, and was hailed as a visionary. But beneath the polished veneer, a different story emerged in the archives of local news sites. A pattern of aggressive acquisitions, of small businesses pushed out, of historic buildings mysteriously catching fire just before a scheduled heritage review. She found a picture of him at a gala, his arm around the mayor, his smile as wide and predatory as a shark S. Standing just behind him, looking impeccably tailored and coolly observant, was Julian Croft. The sight of him made her skin prickle. She could almost hear his voice, smooth and cutting, dismantling her arguments one by one. Her own self-doubt whispered along with him. You're not your mother. You're a paralegal. You're going to lose. Back at the shop, Maeve seemed to exist in a different reality. She hummed as she pruned a row of bonsai trees, her focus absolute. We received their offer, Ellie said, holding up a new envelope that had arrived that morning. It was exactly as Arthur had predicted. A lowball figure that wouldn't even cover the cost of relocating their inventory, let alone compensate for the loss of a home and a business. It's an insult, of course it is, Maeve said without looking up. A bully never starts with a kindness. Did you file the papers? Ellie took a deep breath. She had spent the last of her savings on the court filing fees. She had officially filed a lawsuit against Finch Development Group, seeking a declaratory judgment to affirm their ownership of the property at 142 Blossom Street. I did, she said. I filed it this morning. Maeve finally put down her shears and turned to face her granddaughter. She took Ellie's hand, her palm rough and warm. Good. Now the real work begins. The legal battle is yours. But the strength to fight it, that comes from here. She squeezed Ellie's hand. Your mother, she was a mighty oak. Brilliant and strong. But you, Alara, you are like the wild violet. You grow in the cracks of the pavement. People underestimate you. And then one day they look down and see you have broken through the stone. The words were meant to be comforting, but they only highlighted Ellie's deepest fears. Her mother was an oak. She was a weed. How could a weed possibly stand against a bulldozer? The lawsuit was a declaration of war. The first response from Finch's legal team was a salvo of motions designed to intimidate and exhaust. A motion to dismiss on grounds of frivolity. A motion for sanctions against Ellie for filing a baseless claim. Each one was a dense, jargon-filled document, meticulously crafted by Julian Croft's team to make her feel small and foolish. Ellie worked from a corner table in the Gilded Lily, the scent of lilies and damp earth a stark contrast to the sterile language of the law. She spent hours researching case law, her laptop glowing late into the night, surrounded by wilting flowers and empty coffee cups. Every legal precedent she found in their favor was matched by two that seemed to support Finch. The weight of the paper, both digital and physical, was crushing. One afternoon, Ben Carter walked in, his journalist's notepad in hand, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. I saw the court filing, he said, leaning against the counter. It's all over the legal blogs. Flower shop takes on real estate titan. You've got guts, Ellie. Guts or insanity, Ellie muttered, rubbing her tired eyes. The jury's still out. I want to write about it, he said. Not just the legal side. The human side. The story of this place, Ellie hesitated. The last thing she wanted was public scrutiny, especially with Finch's reputation for using the media as a weapon. But then she looked at Maeve, who was showing a young girl how to pot a succulent, her patience infinite. She looked at the photos on the wall, black and white images of her grandfather standing proudly in front of the shop, a younger Maeve by his side. Ben wasn't just a journalist, he was a storyteller. And their story was the most powerful weapon they had. Okay, she agreed. But you have to tell it right. Ben's first article was a masterpiece of narrative journalism. He didn't just write about the lawsuit. He wrote about the smell of the shop, the history etched into the worn floorboards, Maeve's stories of selling flowers to generations of the same families. He painted Finch not just as a developer, but as an eraser of memory. The story was picked up by other local outlets. Suddenly, the Gilded Lily wasn't just Lot 7B. It was a cause. Customers began stopping by not just to buy flowers, but to offer support. An elderly woman dropped off a petition with hundreds of signatures. A local baker brought them scones and promised to donate a portion of his sales to their legal fund. A hashtag "Bloom Where You're Planted" started trending on social media. The small trickle of community support became a steady, nourishing stream. It didn't change the legal reality, but it changed Ellie. She felt less like a lone weed and more like part of a resilient meadow. The first official communication from Julian Croft was an email requesting a preliminary meeting. His tone was brisk and dismissive. He wanted to discuss a realistic resolution before his clients were forced to pursue more aggressive legal remedies. They met in a sterile conference room at his firm, the same firm Ellie had just left. The air was thick with tension. Julian Croft was exactly as she remembered him from firm functions. Impeccably dressed, with intelligent, cold eyes and an air of detached superiority. "Alara," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He didn't offer to shake hands. "I'll be blunt. My client is prepared to increase his offer substantially. More than generous for a property of this nature. In return, you drop this fanciful lawsuit. It's not for sale, Julian," Ellie said, her voice steadier than she expected. He gave a small, pitying smile. "Your mother was one of the most brilliant legal minds I ever encountered. She was a pragmatist. She knew which fights were worth having and which were sentimental follies. She would have advised you to take the deal." The mention of her mother was a deliberate, calculated blow. He was trying to get inside her head, to weaponize her own self-doubt. The anger that flared in her chest was hot and clean. "You're right," Ellie said, leaning forward. "My mother was a pragmatist. But she also believed that the law was supposed to protect people like my grandmother from people like your client. She believed in the power of a promise. And this lawsuit is about a promise, written on paper and paid for with 50 years of rent. We're not dropping it." Croft's smile vanished. For the first time, a flicker of something other than condescension appeared in his eyes. It might have been respect, or it might have been the irritation of a man whose time was being wasted. "Very well," he said, closing his leather-bound folder. "Then we'll see you in court. Don't say I didn't warn you." As Ellie walked out of the building and back into the sunlit, breathing world, she felt a profound shift within herself. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in charge. Julian Croft had meant to intimidate her, to remind her that she was not her mother. But he had accomplished the opposite. He had reminded her that she was her mother's daughter. And the fight had only just begun. The motion to dismiss was scheduled for a preliminary hearing. It wasn't the trial itself, but it was the first real test. If the judge dismissed the case, their fight would be over before it even started. The night before the hearing, Ellie couldn't sit still. The shop, usually a place of comfort, felt like a cage. Every petal and leaf seemed to be holding its breath. Maeve was in the greenhouse, humming a tune Ellie didn't recognize as she meticulously repotted a collection of rare black orchids. "You're going to wear a trench in the floor," Maeve observed without turning around. "I'm going up against Julian Croft tomorrow," Ellie said, her voice tight. "He thinks I'm a joke." "The judge will probably think I'm a joke." "Julian Croft knows nothing about orchids," Maeve said, her focus still on the plant in her hands. "This one is a Phalaenopsis sumatrana. It needs very specific conditions to thrive. It looks delicate, but its root system is incredibly strong. It holds on. It doesn't let go." She finally turned to face Ellie, her eyes clear and steady. "You have good roots, Alara. Your grandfather's integrity. Your mother's mind. This shop. This community. They are all holding you up. You just have to trust them." The next morning, Ellie stood before the mirror in her apartment. She had chosen her suit carefully. It wasn't a power suit like the ones her mother used to wear. It was a simple, well-tailored navy blue, professional but not aggressive. Looking at her reflection, she saw the familiar signs of anxiety in her wide eyes. But she also saw something new, a flicker of resolve. She thought of Maeve's orchids, of their stubborn, tenacious roots. The courtroom was an imposing, wood-paneled space designed to make the individual feel small. Alastair Finch was there, sitting beside Julian Croft, looking relaxed and confident, as if he were merely observing a tedious but necessary formality. He exuded an aura of immense power and entitlement. Julian Croft's argument for dismissal was brilliant, a masterclass in legal rhetoric. He was smooth, articulate, and devastatingly logical. He painted the 50-year clause as a romantic but legally meaningless piece of marginalia, an anachronistic artifact with no standing in modern property law. He cited case after case, building an impenetrable wall of precedent. Ellie felt her own carefully prepared arguments turning to ash in her mouth. How could she possibly compete with this? When it was her turn to speak, her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands felt slick on the lectern. She looked at the judge, an older woman with a stern but intelligent face, and took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of Maeve's faith, of the community's hope, of 50 years of history on her shoulders. She started, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't try to match Croft's slick, corporate style. Instead, she told a story. "Your Honor," she began, "Mr. Croft is correct. This case is about a piece of paper. But it is also about what that paper represents. For 50 years, my family has fulfilled every single obligation under this lease. They have paid their rent, maintained the property, and just as the clause states, they have cultivated a community." She didn't just talk about contract law, she talked about the flower shop. She talked about the generations of customers, the role it played as a neighborhood hub, a place of beauty and solace in a rapidly changing city. She argued that the handwritten clause wasn't an afterthought, it was the very heart of the agreement. It was a promise, and the law at its best was a mechanism for ensuring promises are kept. Finch Development argues this clause is an anachronism, she concluded, her voice now strong and clear. I argue it is a testament to a form of business, a form of community that is worth preserving. To dismiss this case would be to declare that a 50-year promise has no value, that a handshake backed by ink is meaningless, that a multinational corporation's desire for profit can and should erase a lifetime of good faith. She sat down, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had no idea if she had succeeded, as she had simply spoken her truth. The judge looked from Ellie to Croft, her expression unreadable. As she cleared her throat, "Oh, Mr. Croft, your argument is legally sound and well articulated. However, the unusual nature of this addendum, combined with the documented 50 years of faithful tenancy, suggests that a summary dismissal would be premature." A collective gasp went through the small section of the gallery filled with the shop's supporters. "I am denying the motion to dismiss," the judge declared. "This case will proceed. I'll see you both in court for the preliminary injunction hearing in 30 days. Ellie felt the world tilt on its axis. They had won. It wasn't the war, but it was the first crucial battle. She looked over at the opposing table. Alastair Finch's confident smile was gone, replaced by a thunderous scowl. Julian Croft was staring at her, his face a mask of disbelief. In his eyes, she saw that he no longer thought she was a joke. He now saw her as a problem. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, Ellie felt a profound sense of relief, but also a new, heavier weight. She had crossed a threshold. There was no going back. She had looked Goliath in the eye, and he hadn't crushed her. The point of no return was behind her, and the long, uncertain road of the fight stretched ahead. Winning the motion to dismiss was like surviving the first wave of an invasion. It provided a moment of dizzying relief, followed by the chilling realization that the main army was still on its way. The news sent a ripple of excitement through their supporters. Ben Carter's follow-up article framed it as a modern-day David Sling's first stone at real estate Goliath, and for a few days, the Gilded Lily was filled with well-wishers and reporters. But in the quiet hours after the shop closed, the reality of their situation settled back in. Julian Croft, having underestimated her once, would not make the same mistake again. The legal battle that followed was a war of attrition. Croft's team buried Ellie in a blizzard of paperwork, interrogatories, requests for production of documents, subpoenas. They demanded every receipt, every ledger, every piece of correspondence related to the shop for the last 50 years. It was a classic corporate litigation tactic: Bleed the smaller opponent dry, exhaust their resources, and bury them in procedural minutiae until they surrender. Ellie found herself working 18-hour days, fueled by stale coffee and sheer adrenaline. By day, she helped Maeve run the shop, the familiar rhythm of snipping stems and tying ribbons a necessary balm for her frayed nerves. By night, she sat at the old oak counter, her laptop a starkly modern intruder, sifting through a half-century of her family's life, now categorized as legal exhibits. Maeve, for her part, seemed almost oblivious to the legal storm. Her focus was on what she called the floral law. Every plant has a strategy for survival, she told Ellie one evening, holding up a small, unassuming succulent. This one is called hens and chicks. See how the mother plant sends out these little offshoots? It creates a community. If the main plant is threatened, the smaller ones are already rooted, ready to carry on. It shares its strength. Ellie, deep in a document request demanding a detailed accounting of every utility bill since 1985, barely looked up. That's great, Grandma. Does it have a strategy for dealing with emotion for summary judgment? Maeve simply smiled. Patience, Alara. You're looking for answers in his language. The real answers are in ours. The first face-to-face confrontation after the hearing was a deposition. They were in another soulless conference room, a court reporter clicking away silently. This time it was Julian Croft questioning May. Ellie sat beside her grandmother, her hands clenched, ready to object to protect her. She expected Croft to be aggressive, to try and twist Maeve's words, to paint her as a confused old woman. But he was cleverer than that. His approach was one of disarming charm. He spoke to Maeve in a gentle, almost patronizing tone. Mrs. Vance, he began, his voice soft. 50 years is a long time. Memories can fade. Are you quite certain you recall the specifics of this unusual clause being discussed? I remember my husband, Michael, coming home that evening, Maeve said, her voice calm and clear. He was so proud. He said he'd made a deal not just for a shop, but for a future. He said Mr. Abernathy, the original owner, believed in putting down roots. A 50-year lease was a promise, he said. And the clause was the handshake that sealed it. A handshake, Croft repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Not say a clause drafted by a team of lawyers. Some of the strongest things are not drafted by lawyers, Mr. Croft, Maeve replied, her gaze unwavering. Of friendships, families, gardens, Croft shifted his line of attack. And in all the years since, in all the notices of new ownership you must have received, did you ever once write to the new landlords to, shall we say, remind them of this unique arrangement? Why would I? Maeve asked, a hint of steel in her voice. The lease speaks for itself. So we held up our end of the bargain. We trusted the paper and the people behind it to do the same. Trust, Mr. Croft should not have an expiration date, Ellie watched, mesmerized. Maeve wasn't being deposed, she was holding court. Croft's clever questions, designed to trip her up, slid right off her simple, unshakable sincerity. He was trying to play chess, but she was tending her garden and his rules didn't apply. He tried one last time, his charm giving way to a sharper edge. Your business has had its ups and downs, I imagine. Financial struggles, life has ups and downs, Maeve corrected him gently. We persevered. We always paid our rent, but you never attempted to purchase the property outright before this. We didn't need to, Maeve said with a serene smile. We were already buying it. 1 month at a time for 50 years. Julian Croft concluded the deposition shortly after. He had gotten nothing. As they packed up their papers, he approached Ellie, his expression unreadable. She's a compelling witness, he said, his voice low. She's my grandmother, Ellie replied. A piece of friendly advice, Croft said, his eyes locking onto hers. My client does not like to lose. This isn't a game to him. The longer you drag this out, the more unpleasant it will become. For everyone, it was a threat wrapped in the guise of professional courtesy. As they left the building, the first salvo had been fired and repelled. But Ellie knew Croft's warning was not an empty one. The war was about to escalate. Julian Croft's warning proved prophetic. The first sign of escalation wasn't a legal document, but a series of anonymous complaints. A city inspector showed up, citing a supposed violation regarding their hand-painted sign, which had hung in the same spot for 40 years. Another complaint was filed about the overgrowth from their window boxes encroaching on the public sidewalk. They were small, petty harassments designed to chip away at their morale. But Alastair Finch had underestimated the deep roots the gilded lily had in the neighborhood. When the story of the sign violation came out, thanks to another pointed article by Ben Carter, a quiet rebellion began. The next morning, a dozen other shopkeepers on the street had hung hand-painted signs in their own windows, declaring, "We stand with the gilded lily." The local coffee shop, the very one that represented the encroaching modern world, put out a tip jar labeled Gilded Lily Legal Fund and offered a free coffee to anyone who signed the petition. The community's support transformed from a passive stream into an active, bubbling spring. A local law professor from the university offered to help Ellie with her research pro bono. Art students created beautiful posters with floral motifs and slogans like "Can't Uproot Us," and plastered them around the neighborhood. The resistance was creative, heartfelt, and utterly organic. Ben Carter became a regular fixture at the shop, his role evolving from journalist to ally. He wasn't just reporting the story anymore, he was helping to shape it. He spent hours in the city archives, digging not just into the shop's history but into Alastair Finch's. "He's got a pattern," Ben said one evening, spreading out photocopied newspaper clippings on the shop counter. Look here." 2010, a historic bookstore in the North Quarter. A series of unfortunate plumbing issues, followed by a lowball offer from a shell corporation Finch controlled. 2014, a family-run theater. A sudden massive property tax hike after the block was rezoned. Finch swept in and bought it for pennies on the dollar. Each story was a ghost of what they were currently experiencing. Finch didn't just build buildings, he orchestrated collapses. The energy of the community was a powerful antidote to Finch's campaign of intimidation. It culminated in a fundraising event organized by a committee of local business owners. They held it in the small park across the street from the shop. It was a beautiful, clear evening. Strings of fairy lights were hung between the trees. A local band played, and people bid on donated items in a silent auction. Ellie stood on the edge of the crowd, watching, feeling a lump form in her throat. Hundreds of people were there, friends, neighbors, strangers. They were all there for them, for the shop. Maeve was in the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a queen holding court, accepting hugs and thanks, her face radiant. "See," a voice said beside her. It was Ben. "This is what you're fighting for. It's not just a building. It's the heart of a neighborhood." Ellie nodded, unable to speak. For the first time, she felt the true scale of the fight. It had started as a personal battle to save her family's legacy, but it had become something much larger. They were fighting for the idea that a community's soul was not a commodity to be bought and sold. From across the park, she saw a car slow down, a sleek black town car with tinted windows. She couldn't see who was inside, but she knew. She could feel the cold, assessing gaze of Alastair Finch, watching the joyful, defiant gathering that stood in the way of his pinnacle. The car didn't stop. It just paused, a predator observing its prey, before silently gliding away into the city's traffic. The rally was a success, raising a significant amount for their legal defense. But as Ellie watched the town car disappear, she knew the money wasn't what mattered most. The rally had shown Finch that they were not alone. And it had shown Ellie that the roots Maeve was always talking about were deeper and stronger than she had ever imagined. While Ellie marshaled legal precedents and community support, Maeve was engaged in a different kind of preparation. She called it shoring up the defenses, but her methods had little to do with the law. She began giving Ellie a series of strange, seemingly random horticultural assignments. "The soil in the west window box is tired," she announced one morning. "It needs yarrow." "Yarrow?" Ellie asked, distracted by a legal brief. "What for?" "Yarrow has a deep taproot," Maeve explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It draws up nutrients from deep in the earth that other plants can't reach. It strengthens everything around it. It's a healer." She pressed a packet of tiny dust-like seeds into Ellie's hand. "Plant it. And think about what's hidden deep down that can give you strength." Feeling foolish but unwilling to argue, Ellie planted the yarrow. A few days later, Maeve had her create a specific arrangement for the front counter, one composed entirely of plants known for their resilience: thistle, statice, and hellebore, the winter rose that could bloom in the snow. "This isn't a bouquet," Maeve said. "It's a statement of intent. It says we will endure. That we can find beauty even in the harshest conditions." Ellie found herself caught between two worlds. Her logical mind, the paralegal part of her brain, told her this was all just sentimental nonsense, her grandmother's way of coping with the stress. But another part of her, the part that had grown up in the magical world of the Gilded Lily, couldn't dismiss it so easily. There was a strange power in Maeve's floral law, a philosophy of survival learned from millennia of botanical evolution. The resilience of the thistle, the deep-rooted strength of the yarrow, it began to seep into her. The upcoming preliminary injunction hearing was the next major hurdle. Ellie needed to convince the judge to officially halt the eviction until the ownership case was fully decided. It was their best chance to win the time they needed to build their case. Julian Croft's team had already filed their opposition, a document filled with economic arguments about the cost of delaying Finch's multi-million-dollar project and affidavits from city planners about the importance of the new development. Ellie was struggling to find a legal hook, a compelling argument that went beyond the emotional appeal of their story. One evening, frustrated and exhausted, she was aimlessly tidying the shop's back room when she stumbled upon a box labeled Community Garden Project, 1978. Inside were old photos and letters. It was a project her grandfather had started, turning a derelict, trash-filled lot at the end of their block into a vibrant community garden. There were letters of thanks from neighbors, and a small, framed certificate of appreciation from the city's Parks Department. She brought the box out to Maeve. "I'd forgotten all about this," Maeve's eyes lit up. "Oh, the garden. Your grandfather poured his heart into that soil. He said a neighborhood needs a place to grow things together. And it was so popular. It was right where that glass coffee place is now." A thought sparked in Ellie's mind, connecting Maeve's floral law to the legal world. She remembered the phrase from the handwritten clause, a recognition of enduring community cultivation. "Grandma," Ellie said slowly, her legal mind starting to whir. "This wasn't just a hobby, was it, this garden? It was part of the shop's identity. Part of its role in the community, of course," Maeve said. "The Gilded Lily isn't just what's inside these four walls. It's the seeds it plants outside." Ellie scrambled for her laptop. Community cultivation wasn't just poetry. It was a tangible, provable action. Her grandfather hadn't just run a business, he had actively improved the neighborhood. He had fulfilled the spirit of that clause in ways that went far beyond simply paying rent. It was a pattern of behavior, a 50-year history of investing in the community. This was the deep taproot Maeve had been talking about. She started to type, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wasn't just arguing about a contract anymore. She was presenting a 50-year history of civic engagement and value that Finch's development could never replace. She would use the community garden, the neighborhood events the shop had sponsored, the generations of customers, all of it, to build a case that cultivation was a core, demonstrable part of the agreement. The yarrow seeds in the window box had begun to sprout, their feathery green leaves pushing through the dark soil. Ellie finally understood. Maeve's floral law wasn't about magic. It was about seeing the world differently. It was about understanding strategy, resilience, and the power of putting down deep roots. And Ellie had just found the root of their legal argument. Just as Ellie felt a surge of momentum, Finch retaliated. He didn't counter with a legal filing. He attacked on a different front, public opinion. A slick, professional-looking website appeared online, Progress4Downtown.com. It was funded by a concerned citizens group that was transparently a front for Finch development. The site was filled with architectural renderings of the pinnacle, showcasing a gleaming tower with rooftop parks and public art installations. It promised jobs, economic growth, and a vibrant future. And then it turned its focus to the Gilded Lily. The narrative it spun was insidious. It didn't paint Maeve and Ellie as villains, but as tragic, misguided sentimentalists. An anonymous source was quoted expressing sympathy for the Vance family, but lamenting their inability to adapt to the times. The article then pivoted to a new, shocking claim. It dredged up the memory of Ellie's father, Maeve's son, who had passed away years ago. He had been a kind, creative man, but a terrible businessman. His attempt to open a second, more modern flower shop in the suburbs had ended in bankruptcy a decade before his death. The article used his failure as a cudgel. It implied a pattern of financial mismanagement in the Vance family. While their sentimentality is charming, the article concluded. Can we trust the stewardship of a prime piece of city real estate to a family with a documented history of financial instability? The blow was devastatingly personal. It wasn't just a legal tactic, it was a desecration of her father's memory. The story was picked up by a prominent city blogger known for his pro-development stance. The comments section was brutal. The narrative began to shift. Were they heroes fighting for their home, or were they just stubborn Luddites holding the city's progress hostage? The harassment from the city inspectors intensified. They were now being threatened with fines. The pressure was immense, a coordinated attack on their finances, their reputation, and their emotional well-being. Ellie was furious. She wanted to issue a press release to fight back, but she knew that engaging with them on their terms was a losing battle. Never wrestle with a pig, Arthur Sterling had once told her. You both get dirty and the pig likes it. Maeve, however, was unfazed by the public smearing. When Ellie showed her the article, her expression hardened, but not with shame. And it was with a quiet, steely anger. Your father was a dreamer, Alara, she said softly. He tried to fly too close to the sun. But he had more integrity in his little finger than Alastair Finch has in his entire body. They want to talk about our history, let them. Our history is one of honesty. Let's see how Mr. Finch's holds up to the same scrutiny. Her words strengthened Ellie's resolve. Finch wanted to play dirty, fine. Then they needed to find the dirt on him. She called Ben. Finch is attacking my father, she said, her voice shaking with rage. He's opened the door. Maeve's right. We need to look at his history. Not just his corporate history. Everything. Ben's voice on the other end of the line was grim. I've been digging, Ellie. It's hard. The man's past is sanitized. But I might have something. A name. Thomas Finch, his father, Ellie said. And his mentor, Ben added. A man named Silas Croft. The name hit Ellie like a physical blow. Croft, as in Julian Croft, his grandfather, Ben confirmed. It seems the Finches and the Crofts have a long and profitable history together. I'm looking into a series of zoning changes from the 70s. It's probably nothing, but the names keep popping up together. A zoning change from the 70s. A cold dread, heavy and absolute, began to settle over Ellie. The fight had just become infinitely more complex and far more personal than she could have ever imagined. Finch hadn't just attacked her past. He had inadvertently given her a key to unlocking his own. The day of the preliminary injunction hearing arrived, cloaked in a tense gray drizzle that mirrored Ellie's mood. The courtroom was more crowded this time. On one side sat Alastair Finch and his team, a phalanx of dark suits. On the other, a vibrant, determined group of supporters from the neighborhood filled the benches behind Ellie and Maeve. Ellie's hands were cold, but her mind was sharp. She had spent the last week weaving together her argument, combining the legal with the narratives. She had the story of the community garden, the affidavits from other local business owners, the 50 years of flawless rent receipts. She was ready. Julian Croft spoke first. His argument was a clinical appeal to economics and civic planning. He presented the pinnacle as an engine of progress, a vital project being held up by the intransigent and financially questionable demands of a single tenant. He subtly referenced the articles about Ellie's father, painting a picture of a failing business in a blighted building. He argued that the financial harm to his client and the city for every day of delay was real and substantial, while the harm to the Vances was purely sentimental. Then it was Ellie's turn. She walked to the lectern, feeling the collective gaze of the room. She took a deep breath, picturing the yarrow in the window box, its roots digging deep. She began not with the lace, but with the community. Oh, Mr. Croft speaks of financial harm, she said, her voice clear and steady. I want to speak of a different kind of value. The value of a place that knows your name. The value of a business that measures its success not in quarterly earnings, but in generations of customers. She laid out her evidence of community cultivation. She presented the photos of the community garden, her grandfather smiling, covered in dirt, surrounded by happy neighbors. She presented the certificate from the city. She showed the judge the petitions, the letters of support, the articles Ben had written. The clause in this lease is not just about ownership, she argued. It's about stewardship. My family has been the steward of this property and this community for 50 years. They have earned it. not just by paying rent, but by pouring their lives into the soil of this neighborhood. She concluded by looking directly at the judge. Your Honor, granting this injunction is not about sentiment. It is about affirming that long-term commitment and good faith stewardship have tangible legal weight. It is about allowing a 50-year promise the chance to be heard, rather than letting it be silenced by a bulldozer. She sat down, her heart pounding. The judge listened to both sides, her face impassive. She reviewed the documents, the silence in the courtroom stretching for an eternity. Finally, she looked up. The court recognizes the significant economic interests of the plaintiff, Finch Development, she began, and Ellie's stomach dropped. However, the defendant has presented a compelling and well-documented argument that their claim is neither frivolous nor purely sentimental. The unique nature of the cultivation clause, supported by 50 years of evidence, warrants a full and thorough hearing. She took a breath. Therefore, the court grants the motion for a preliminary injunction. The defendants are protected from eviction until the matter of ownership is fully adjudicated. A wave of elation and relief washed through Ellie, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. They had done it. They had won a shield. Maeve squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with tears. Their supporters behind them broke into hushed, joyful whispers. Across the room, Alastair Finch slammed his leather folio shut, his face a mask of cold fury. He leaned over and said something sharp and low to Julian Croft. Croft's face was pale, his professional composure momentarily shattered. He had lost. He had lost to a paralegal in a flower shop. He looked at Ellie, and this time there was no condescension in his gaze. There was only the cold, hard glint of a rival who had been beaten and who would not let it happen again. The victory was intoxicating, a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. But as Ellie met Croft's gaze across the courtroom, a shiver went down her spine. This fragile victory had changed the game. She had wounded a powerful man's pride. And now he wasn't just going to fight to win. He was going to fight to destroy. The victory of the injunction was a high, but the fall was swift and brutal. Alastair Finch and Julian Croft, humiliated in court, unleashed the full, terrifying power of their corporate legal machine. They buried Ellie in discovery, but this time it was different. It wasn't just about exhausting her. It was a targeted search for a kill shot. Ben's research into the 1970s zoning changes had become their primary focus. The connection between Finch's father, Croft's grandfather, and the rezoning felt significant, but they couldn't find the smoking gun. It was all circumstantial, a web of old corporate filings and city council meeting minutes that hinted at cronyism but proved nothing concrete. And then Croft found it. It arrived as a motion for summary judgment, a legal filing arguing that there were no facts in dispute and the judge should rule in Finch's favor immediately without a full trial. The core of the motion was a single devastating piece of evidence, City Ordinance 78B, passed in 1978. The ordinance had rezoned their entire block for high-density commercial development. It was the very same ordinance Ben had been investigating. But Croft's argument was one Ellie hadn't anticipated. He wasn't arguing that the rezoning was corrupt. He was arguing that it was the law. His legal brief was a masterpiece of cold logic. It claimed that the moment the city rezoned the property, any private agreement that contradicted the new zoning, like, for instance, a clause transferring ownership of a single-story retail shop, was rendered null and void by the principle of eminent domain and the supremacy of municipal authority. The city had declared the land was for a high-rise, therefore it could not be a flower shop forever. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face as she read it. It was brilliant. It was airtight. It sidestepped their entire argument about promises and good faith and replaced it with the cold, unassailable power of government authority. She took it to the law professor who had been helping her. He read it, his expression growing grimmer with every page. "He's got you, I'm afraid," the professor said, his voice gentle. "This is a very strong argument. It's an act of municipal authority. It likely supersedes a private lease agreement. I don't see a way around it." All the hope, all the momentum from their injunction victory evaporated in an instant. The community's support, the petitions, the 50 years of history, none of it mattered in the face of a city ordinance. They had been outmaneuvered, beaten by a legal technicality from 40 years ago. The news hit the shop like a physical blow. The joyful energy that had filled the space for weeks was replaced by a heavy, defeated silence. The stress took its toll on Maeve. One afternoon, Ellie found her in the greenhouse, her face pale, her hand pressed against her chest. She was having trouble breathing. The paramedics were calm and efficient, but the sight of her grandmother looking so small and frail on a gurney being wheeled out of the shop shattered something inside Ellie. At the hospital, the doctor said it was a minor heart episode brought on by stress and exhaustion. She would be fine, but she needed to rest to avoid any more strain. Ellie sat by Maeve's hospital bed, holding her grandmother's hand, feeling the fragile, fluttering pulse. All the fight went out of her. What had she been thinking? She had dragged her grandmother through this brutal public battle. She had put her health at risk. For what? A futile defense of a memory Finch had won. He had beaten her in the law, and he had broken her in spirit. That evening, she went back to the empty, silent shop. The air was thick with the scent of wilting flowers. It felt like a funeral home. She sat at the counter, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to draft a letter to Julian Croft. It was a letter of surrender. The hospital room was quiet, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Maeve was asleep, her face etched with a weariness that went deeper than the recent health scare. Ellie sat beside her, the unsent letter of surrender folded in her pocket, a leaden weight against her leg. She felt hollowed out, defeated. All the fight, all the fire she discovered within herself had been extinguished. She watched her grandmother's chest rise and fall. Even in sleep, Maeve's fingers were curled slightly, as if tending to an unseen plant. The image brought back a memory of one of Maeve's recent floral law lessons. It had been just a few weeks ago, on a day filled with hope. Maeve had pointed to a crack in the pavement just outside the shop's entrance, where a stubborn, leafy plant was defiantly growing. "That's Japanese knotweed," Maeve had said. "It's the bane of every gardener. People try to poison it, pave over it, tear it out. But it always comes back. Its roots can go 20 feet deep. They can sense weakness in foundations, in pipes, and exploit it. It thrives in disturbed soil. The more you try to fight it on the surface, the more aggressively it grows underneath." The memory was so vivid, it was as if Maeve had just spoken the words. It thrives in disturbed soil. A thought, faint and distant, began to stir in the fog of Ellie's despair. Disturbed soil. She pulled out her phone and scrolled back through her email exchanges with Ben Carter. He had sent her a file weeks ago, a list of the companies and individuals who had lobbied the city council for the 1978 zoning change. She had glanced at it, but dismissed it as a dead end when she couldn't find a direct link to Thomas Finch. She opened the file again. At the top of the list of petitioners for Ordinance 78B was a small, obscure realty firm, Pioneer Properties, Inc. She ran a quick search on the company. It had been founded in 1975 and had dissolved in 1980. Its entire existence was bookended by the years surrounding the zoning change. It looked like a shell corporation. Disturbed soil. The zoning change was the disturbance. Pioneer Properties was the knotweed, a temporary entity that had emerged to exploit the situation before disappearing. On a hunch, she cross-referenced the names of Pioneer's board members with the research Ben had done on Silas Croft, Julian's grandfather. There it was. A shared address. One of the board members of Pioneer Properties had listed the same P.O. box as Silas Croft's private law practice. It was a tiny link, a single tenuous thread. But it was there. This wasn't just a case of Finch's father benefiting from a convenient zoning chain. This was evidence that his and Croft's predecessors had actively, covertly engineered it. The principal, Julian Croft, was relying on the supremacy of municipal authority, rested on the assumption that the authority was acting in good faith. But what if it wasn't? What if the ordinance was the result of a corrupt, bad faith manipulation by the very parties who stood to benefit? A new energy surged through Ellie, a fierce, desperate spark. She wasn't just defending against Croft's argument anymore. She could attack it at its foundation. She could argue that Ordinance 78B was not a neutral act of governance, but the fruit of a poisoned tree, a tool of predation designed by Finch's and Croft's own mentors. She looked at Maeve, sleeping peacefully. Surrender was no longer an option. The knotweed had found a crack in the foundations. She tore the letter in her pocket into tiny pieces and dropped them in the trash can. The fight wasn't over. She just needed to dig deeper. Ellie didn't sleep. She met Ben at an all-night diner, the air thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee. As she laid out what she had found, the spark in her eyes was contagious. Ben, who had been feeling as defeated as she was, leaned forward, his journalistic instincts reignite. "A shell corporation," he said, his voice low with excitement. "If we can prove Pioneer was controlled by Finch's and Croft's families, we can prove the whole zoning change was a sham." For the next 48 hours, they lived on coffee and adrenaline. They became a two-person investigative team, tearing through digital archives and public records. Ben used his press credentials to access city planning documents that were not available online. Ellie used her legal knowledge to follow the chain of titles and corporate filings. They worked out of the shop's back room, surrounded by the scent of drying flowers. Their conspiracy bored a chaotic web of names, dates, and arrows drawn on a large piece of butcher paper. And slowly, painstakingly, they pieced it together. Pioneer Properties had purchased options on several other properties on the block in the years leading up to the zoning change. After Ordinance 78B was passed, dramatically increasing the value of the land, Pioneer hadn't developed the properties. Instead, it had sold the options for a massive profit to another company. That company, they discovered, was a subsidiary of the early real estate empire run by Thomas Finch. Silas Croft had been the lawyer who brokered the deal. It was a classic predatory real estate scheme. They had used a disposable shell company to lobby for a zoning change that benefited them, then cashed out, leaving no direct trail. They had disturbed the soil, reaped the rewards, and then vanished. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. Maeve, back home from the hospital and under strict orders to rest, had been sorting through old photo albums. She found a picture from a 1977 Neighborhood Merchants Association dinner. In the photo, a younger, beaming Maeve stood beside Ellie's grandfather. But in the background, at a corner table, were three men deep in conversation: Ellie's original landlord, Mr. Abernathy, looking worried, a confident, smiling Thomas Finch, and a sharp-featured Silas Croft. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was a picture that told a story. It placed all the players in the same room, at the same time, just before the zoning change was pushed through. It gave life to the paper trail. Armed with this new evidence, Ellie felt a profound shift in her strategy. She couldn't win by arguing the letter of the law. Croft had already proven that. She had to argue the story, the history, the intent. She had to expose the entire 50-year narrative, not just her family's, but the Finches and the Crofts as well. She had to show the judge that Ordinance 78B wasn't a law to be respected, but a conspiracy to be condemned. The day of the summary judgment hearing dawned bright and clear. As Ellie walked toward the courthouse, she felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She wasn't a frightened paralegal anymore. She wasn't trying to be her mother. She was herself, Alara Vance, granddaughter of Maeve, and she was ready for her final stand. The courtroom was a theater of silent tension. Alastair Finch and Julian Croft sat at their table, radiating an aura of inevitable victory. They believed the zoning ordinance was an unassailable fortress. They were about to find out that Ellie had found a way to tunnel underneath it. Julian Croft presented his argument for summary judgment first. He was, as always, polished and precise. He laid out the case for the supremacy of Ordinance 78B with chilling efficiency. The law was the law, he argued. The city had spoken, and any private contract to the contrary was irrelevant. He concluded with an air of finality, as if the matter were already settled. Then the judge turned to Ellie. "OMS. Vance." Ellie rose and walked to the lectern carrying a single slim folder. She felt the weight of her family's legacy, the hope of her community, and the quiet strength of Maeve's floral law. "Your Honor," she began, her voice resonating with a newfound authority, "Mr. Croft is right. The law is the law. But the law is not merely a collection of words on a page. It is a reflection of intent. It is a vessel for fairness. And we must therefore question the intent behind Ordinance 78B. She didn't present her evidence as a dry list of facts. She wove it into a narrative. She started with the photo. She projected it onto the screen for the whole court to see. Thomas Finch and Silas Croft, deep in conversation with her family's original landlord. This picture was taken in 1977, she said. Shortly after this, a company called Pioneer Properties began lobbying the city to rezone this block. Step by step, she laid out the conspiracy. She showed the corporate filings for Pioneer Properties, highlighting the link to Silas Croft. She showed the property records detailing the options Pioneer had bought. And she showed the final transaction, the massive profit they had made selling those options to Thomas Finch's company immediately after the rezoning they had engineered. Ordinance 78B was not an act of civic planning, Your Honor, Ellie declared, her voice rising with passion. It was an act of predatory capitalism disguised as law. It was a private conspiracy masquerading as public policy. This was not the city speaking. This was the city being used as a puppet by men who sought to enrich themselves at the expense of a community. A murmur went through the courtroom. Julian Croft was on his feet. Objection, this is unsubstantiated conjecture. It's a fantasy, is it, mister? Croft, Ellie countered, her eyes locking with his. Is it a fantasy that our family's histories have been entwined for 50 years? My family, cultivating a community in good faith, and yours, it seems, cultivating profits in bad faith. The blow was direct and personal. Julian's face went white. For the first time, he was speechless. Alastair Finch looked apoplectic, his face flushed with rage. Ellie turned back to the judge. The principle of municipal supremacy relies on the integrity of the municipality. To allow an ordinance born of such a clear and corrupt conflict of interest to nullify a 50-year promise would be a miscarriage of justice. It would reward the poisoner with the fruit of his poison tree. She rested her case. She had done more than just present a legal argument, she had changed the story. She had revealed that the entire foundation of her opponent's case was built on sand. She had found her own voice, not by imitating her mother's, but by weaving together her mother's legal mind with her grandmother's profound understanding of roots, history, and the things that grow in the dark. The judge sat back, her expression a mixture of shock and intense contemplation. She looked at the evidence Ellie had presented. She looked at the furious face of Alastair Finch and the stunned silence of Julian Croft. The law was the law. But justice, she knew, was something more. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge surveyed the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on Julian Croft, whose composure had finally cracked, then on Alastair Finch, who looked as if he were about to explode. Finally, her eyes rested on Ellie. This court takes allegations of bad faith and procedural manipulation very seriously. The judge began, her voice sharp and deliberate. OMS. Vance, you have presented a disturbing, yet compelling, chain of evidence suggesting that the very ordinance upon which the plaintiff's motion rests may be tainted. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. A summary judgment is appropriate only when there are no material facts in dispute. It is clear that the intent and integrity behind Ordinance 78B is now a very significant disputed fact. Therefore, the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment is denied. A wave of gasps and joyful sobs erupted from the benches behind Ellie. But the judge wasn't finished. She held up a hand for silence. Furthermore, she continued, her voice like ice, based on the evidence presented today, this court finds that the defendant has more than established a likelihood of success on the merits of their original claim. The 50-year history of uninterrupted tenancy and good faith community cultivation, combined with the suspect nature of the plaintiff's legal counterargument, leads me to believe that the ownership clause in the original lease is, in all probability, valid and enforceable. It wasn't the final verdict of the trial, but it was the mortal wound. The judge had essentially declared her belief in their case. The trial would be a formality. They had won. Alastair Finch stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He shot a look of pure venom at Julian Croft before storming out of the courtroom, his PR team scrambling after him. The aftermath was a blur of happy tears and embraces. The community supporters swarmed Ellie, clapping her on the back, thanking her. Ben Carter was there, his notepad forgotten, simply grinning. As the crowd began to disperse, Julian Croft approached her. He looked shaken, his usual arrogance completely stripped away. My grandfather, he started, his voice barely a whisper. I never knew. The past has a way of showing up when you least expect it, Ellie said, her anger spent, leaving only a kind of weary sadness. You're not your mother, Croft said, and for a moment Ellie tensed. But then he continued, you're different. Just as brilliant but different. She would have been incredibly proud. He gave a small, stiff nod of respect, a gesture that meant more than any apology, and walked away. The news of the verdict and the explosive allegations of corruption ignited a media firestorm. Alastair Finch's carefully crafted public image was shattered. The city council launched an investigation into the 1978 zoning change and Finch's other development projects. His empire, built on a foundation of secrets, began to crumble. That evening, there was a celebration at the Gilded Lily. The shop overflowed with people, music, and laughter. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and victory. Maeve, looking stronger and more vibrant than she had in months, stood beside Ellie holding a glass of champagne. To the wild violet, Maeve toasted, her eyes shining as she looked at her granddaughter. The one that broke through the stone, Ellie smiled, a real unburdened smile. She looked around at the joyful faces, at the riotous life of the shop, her shop, and felt a profound sense of peace. The battle was over. The ghost of her mother's legacy no longer overshadowed her, it stood beside her. She hadn't just saved a flower shop. She had found herself. 6 months later, a new hand-painted sign hung above the door of the Gilded Lily. It read, "The Gilded Lily. VANCE and VANCE Proprietors. OESD." 1975, the shop was thriving. Its story had made it a city landmark, a symbol of community resilience. Tourists now mixed with the loyal regulars, all wanting to see the little flower shop that had taken on a giant and won. The city, as part of the settlement and in a gesture of public atonement, had officially granted the building heritage status, protecting it forever. Inside, the light was as golden as ever, the air still perfumed with hyacinth and damp earth. Maeve was where she always was, in the greenhouse, humming to her orchids. But the person behind the counter was different. Ellie moved with a new confidence, an easy grace that had replaced her former anxiety. She was no longer just helping out, she was a partner and owner. Her laptop was still on the counter, but now it was open to class notes for her first semester of law school. She was at the top of her class. Ben Carter leaned against the counter, a steady and welcome presence in her life. Their friendship, forged in the trenches of the legal battle, had blossomed into something more. He was finishing a book about the whole affair, a story of community, corruption, and the quiet power of history. The bell above the door sighed its familiar melodic sigh. A young couple came in looking for wedding flowers, their faces full of nervous excitement. "Welcome to the Gilded Lily," Ellie said, her voice warm and sure. "How can I help you?" As she walked them through the options, talking about the meaning of different flowers, listening to their story, she felt a sense of profound rightness. She had found a way to weave the two halves of herself together, the sharp, logical mind of a lawyer and the deeply rooted heart of a florist. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, she joined Maeve in the greenhouse. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, repotting ferns, their hands in the rich, dark soil. "You know," Maeve said, breaking the silence, "your grandfather always said this place was magic." Ellie smiled, tucking a loose frond into the fresh earth. He was right, the magic wasn't in the petals or the leaves, she realized. It was in the continuity, in the promises kept, in the roots that held fast against the storm. It was the magic of endurance. And now the stewardship of that magic was in her hands. The Gilded Lily was safe. Its story would continue. And Alara Vance finally and fully was home.